pretty pumped to be here again this morning. Boy, oh, you can, all right. Usually. If I break this, do I have to pay for it? Well, I'm pretty excited to be here this morning. We're looking at Nehemiah chapter 2. That's where we're going again. And what's fascinating to me is one thing I found out about you folks this week is here we are starting to talk about Nehemiah and the wall and rebuilding the wall. And then I find out that there's a man in your church who's notorious for busting walls down. Which is pretty cool, because he showed me some of the walls he's broken down over in the parsonage there. And I was like, well, that's pretty cool, but when you break them down, you all have to build them back up again, don't you? Well, he's pretty good at building back up again. Not by himself all the time, but he's pretty good at it, I gotta admit. But I got chuckling about it this week, and I thought, here we are talking about a broken down wall in the Old Testament. And here he is, ripping and tearing. My goodness. We're at Nehemiah chapter 2. We're going to bump around here a little bit today. I gave some of you scripture references, and I'm going to ask you to read those passages, if you would, aloud for everyone else, and we'll try and follow along. But as a reminder, what we're doing here is what we did last week. We're looking at a man who hears God's voice by virtue of listening to his brothers and is so grieved he is compelled to pray and fast for about 40 days, somewhere in there, whereupon God leads him to a particular plan of action. And it's a risky one. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. That risky plan of action. I may have mentioned this before. You all know the name Hudson Taylor. And I think may have shared with you before that without risk, he would say, there is no need for faith. That's a saying that's attributed to him. So what we find is what I appreciate about Hudson Taylor and what I appreciate about Nehemiah is that there's a great deal of risk involved for Nehemiah, as we'll look at in just a moment. A great deal of risk. And it's not just physical risk, it's emotional, psychological, but it's also the risk of failure, the risk of fear, and there's a great deal. In fact, he mentions fear here in the second chapter, that he has to go before the king. It's a fearsome thing with an unhappy face. Anyway, in Nehemiah chapter 2, it's a pretty neat thing. Anyway, let's read just a bit of it. And it came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had not been before time sad in his presence. Do you think the king would notice? Do you think it's a wise thing to look sad in the presence of the king? No. In fact, that could really be a punishable offense. However, remember Nehemiah's office? He was the cupbearer. He's the wine and food tester. The second most important man in the kingdom, second only to the king himself. The most trusted man in the kingdom. The man with the most integrity. The man who is willing to put his life on the line for the king. That's a theme we're going to come back to by the time we're done in just a couple of minutes. A man who's willing to sacrifice his life for his king. That's who's Nehemiah's job as the cupbearer. Anyway, as he looks at this whole thing, he's thinking, he's praying, he's thinking that sometimes, and in Nehemiah's case, it was the literal wall of Jerusalem was broken down. But in your outline, sometimes the walls we trust for safety, assurance, and comfort become broken down. That happens frequently in our lives. Sometimes it's called adversity. Sometimes people call it bad luck. Sometimes we call it other things. But in Nehemiah's case, the project is an enormous one. It's not only personal, but it's patriotic. Who will save the city of Jerusalem, God's holy city? Nehemiah thinks it probably God is leading him to do this. There are times, however, when we become broken and beaten down, just like the walls of Jerusalem. And there are usually some pretty easy symptoms to see why we get broken. First is physical ones. In visiting with folks, and it's so wonderful to have you here today. I said to Babs when we came through the back door, I said, there's no one here, but the door's unlocked. Oh no, Rick's going to blame that on me. Yeah, he's shaking his head. And as soon as we stepped through the door, we heard your organ playing. And I thought, oh hallelujah, she's back. That's so cool to walk into this building, just feel the walls jiggle with the sound of that organ. I appreciate that. Praise God for that. But we oftentimes, I'm thinking of that because we've had such a bout with pneumonia and other folks leak out and all these things, and it's wonderful to hear you're a little better at that, and that's pretty neat. But sometimes there are chronic health issues that seem to last forever. But sometimes they're accidents. My wife was in a near-fatal car accident 8 or 9 years ago. That was a chronic crisis for months upon months upon months, and I had to take care of her, so you know what kind of trouble she was in. I overdosed her one. No, first of all, I didn't give her pain medication at the prescribed time. This was the first night she was home from Strong. And I'm reading the doctor's thing, this pill at this time, this pill at that time. Everything on the right side of her body was crushed and smashed. And so we had a hospital bed in the living room and all that. I moved the couch into the dining room, slept there so I could be near to her. I thought, boy, she's sleeping so nicely. I'm not going to wake her up to give her a pill. Uh-oh, you don't do that. Not giving a pill in a regular regimen is as bad as giving too many. Well, I did both. So remarkably, the woman's still alive. If the car crash didn't kill her, I almost did. So we have those kinds of crises where our walls come breaking down. We think we'll never be in a car accident. We'll never get sick. We'll never have parents who are ill that we need to take care of. We just never think of those things when we're younger. Or if we have enough experience, we never think our children will give us heartbreak, or our grandchildren. We never think about those when they're infants, and they look so precious, and then all of us in here probably can attest the fact that when they grow up, especially into the teenage years, we wonder what monster we let into our house. That's not always the case. I've been fortunate and blessed by 2 children who were fine when they were in the house, but once they left, they're driving me nuts. And I love it. But so we have those kinds of things. There are things that happen. We know these things, but oftentimes, and I think on purpose, God allows these things to come into our life, not to punish us, because He wants to teach us something about Himself that we could not learn in any other way. The classic to that is, if you would like to turn briefly back to the book of Job, in chapter 42, actually forward. In Job 42, I think this is we are all familiar with what happens to Job during the book of Job. It's a series of catastrophes after another. A man who was godly beyond belief, a man who was prosperous, a man who treated everyone appropriately, with respect and humility, a man who could be trusted. And God and Satan have this little conversation, and God says, go ahead, see if you can break him. You can't kill him. You can do anything else you want. So what did he lose? Everything, including his health. And he had 3 buddies who weren't any help whatsoever. Get away from guys like that. We don't want to reteach the whole book of Job. But what's I think is one of the most remarkable passages that, and I struggle, I don't know about you, but I struggle when bad things happen. The first reaction I have is, why? And a wise lady once told me, when we were having this conversation, she's going home to be with the Lord now. She said, why not? Do you think there are no conversations in heaven between God and Satan over you? And I was like, I never thought of that. I think that happens. Not in every situation. But what happens in Job's conclusion is absolutely, I think, remarkable. And if any of you have lived through a very difficult circumstance, whether it be health or family or accidents or financial, if you were attentive to being faithful and God's presence in your life, you learned something about God from that experience, did you not? And that's the pattern God wants. We were awfully stiff-necked people. And sometimes God can't get us to pay attention until He gets us down on our knees. And that's what happens to Job. In Job chapter 42, I like to look at, just read verses 1 through 6. It says, Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be hidden withheld from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful to me, which I knew not. Here's Job saying, duh, what an idiot I am. Hear, I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. This was already the paramount righteous man on the planet during this time. Scripture tells us that at the beginning of the book of Job. He's like the Billy Graham, David Jeremiah, Warren Wiersbe all wrapped up into one. He's just a man everybody respects as godly, holy, decent, honest, you name it. He's everything in character you would hope to have in a godly man. And God visits him with this. And you think, well, what more could he possibly have to learn about God? Apparently, something else. Because now, he says, I've heard about God. I'm familiar with what's going on with God. But now, through this experience, I have seen him. And what he's really saying is, I see him in new ways, a way in which I could never have understood the goodness and holiness of God if I hadn't experienced all this. Now, that sounds a little counterintuitive, but it's true. Until our faith is cast into the fire and all the dross is burned off from us, is when we have faith that's pure and purely focused on Christ. So, this is really interesting to me, and I hope to you in some way, because when bad stuff happens, God has something in mind. Do we trust Him? Do we trust Him to show us something that in faith we've never seen before? That's an adventure. But the enemy, of course, is always right there, nagging us to say, but why me, God? Why me? Don't pick me. Go to Jerusalem and rebuild the wall. Pick some other guy. I'm a pretty big shot here in the king's court in Assyria. I don't really want to go to some backwater place where all my relatives have come from. Pick somebody else. Pick Bob. Pick Joe. Pick Billy. But don't pick me. I just made those names up, Joe. So I know they're not in the Bible. I just made them up. Joe is thinking, when I asked him about that. So here we have back to Nehemiah, if we could. Nehemiah, God, I love Nehemiah. I mean, I wish I could see more of myself in Nehemiah, but I see not as much courage as I wished I had. The problem that he faces is not only accepting the responsibility of God's leading, because first of all, a leader must overcome fear. And Nehemiah is going to be a leader. He is a leader. But in order to assume that full-blown position that God's calling him to, he must overcome a number of fears. Have you ever been prodded by God to do something you're just afraid of it? And you're even afraid of listening because, wouldn't you know, God's a trickster and he'll ask you to do the thing you're afraid of the most. Isn't that always the way? He'll say, you don't want to witness? That's okay. Now witness. You don't want to ask forgiveness of someone you offended? Go ask forgiveness. He's always pushing us to that place where we must be obedient and trust the Holy God more. And that's what's happening to God bless Nehemiah. I mean, it's a template for us in many ways, in that here he is in chapter 2, verse 2, in front of the king with his knee knot. Well, you say, well, he's been praying for 40 days. What's he got to be afraid of? Isn't God on his side? This is the beauty of Nehemiah's honesty. That despite the fact that we might be faithful Christians, and I would say all of you are in here, otherwise you wouldn't be here, that there is still despite praying over a particular situation, we can still be approached by fear to keep us going through with what God clearly wants us to do. That's what this is. Chapter 2, verse 2 is exactly where Nehemiah is. If you spent 40 days praying, has anybody ever done that, 40 days praying and fasting? I never have. And I'm not sure exactly what this looked like in Nehemiah's case, but by golly, he was serious about getting an answer from God. And I don't think he stopped praying until God helped him put together a plan of action, which now he's putting into action. See, this is us here, really. In verse 2, it says, "Wherefore the king said to me, Why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick?" Oh. This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was very sore afraid. How can you be afraid, Nehemiah? You're supposed to be God's bigwig here. You spend 40 days praying and fasting, and you're afraid at this point? You're afraid? I thought we weren't supposed to be afraid. No, this is an honest response. I trust in God, but there's that fleshly part of me. Come on, confess it. It's us. We're human beings. We're blood and bones. That part of me that holds me back from loving God fully says, but I'm afraid. I know I've prayed, but I'm a little afraid. My life could end right here at this moment. In verse 3, it could end. My life, you could send me out and have me done away with. I know I prayed, but I still got a little bit I'm scared. Because I just don't know quite what's going to happen either to me, or whether this plan is really from God's, and is God going to open the floodgates here? Or was this all in my head? I made it up in my heart. Is it just flesh? Is it ego? What is this? I have to sort it out. This is the touchstone. If he survives the encounter with the king, he knows it's of God, and on he goes with the grand quest to fulfill the law. Isn't that the neatest thing? Have you ever been to that place where you prayed about something, and yet you know there's this one threshold you kind of got to pass through? This one place, maybe it's witnessing to someone about your faith. For some reason, that does create a bit of apprehension in most of us, I think. Wonder how come? Because it's in flesh. So there was this man in my town, and we lived, Babs and I lived in Geneseo, back to our neighbor. His name was Don Innes. He worked in the geography department at Geneseo. He was one of the, he laughed. When he laughed, you could hear him all over Geneseo. He laughed so loud. He was one of the jolliest creatures I ever met. He was brilliant. He traveled all over the world. He did this fancy thing called intercropping, which was supposed to produce more food in impoverished countries. I think it worked. And everybody loved him. He was a great guy. His wife was just a little different, but he was great. But he was great. And he would laugh at me because I'm just an old country boy. And in the garage we had there, it was an old ramshackle garage. At that time I was teaching in Dansville in the early 70s, and I ran a trap line on my way to school, like some little schoolboy. I drive down in my truck, and I check all my traps on the way down to Dansville along 63. And I start out early, and then I have a big box in the back of my truck. I throw my fur back in there, except one morning I threw one in there, it wasn't quite dead. He got out in the school parking lot. That called for some significant administrative rebuke. So, but I forgot where I was going with this, and now I got to, Don Ennis. Well, Don Ennis, now he was a fine man, but he wasn't a believer. In fact, he was anything he thought. He wasn't an evil man, a conniving man, a sinister man. He just didn't know Christ and didn't want him. And I always felt compelled. Who am I? I'm just a little old country boy. I got dead animals in my garage across the fence from Don Ennis. He knows how many dead animals I got in there. He didn't like me. But I knew I had to witness to him. And I was scared to death. Because he intimidated me, because he was brilliant. I mean, he was really smart. And I just a high school English teacher, country bumpkin, and I never did. Until we moved, and we found out a number of years later that he had terminal cancer. And so I was then compelled by Christ to go visit him at his house and share a little bit about Christ. He rejected it all. But why did I wait so long? Because I was afraid. I was intimidated by him. I was afraid of rejection. I was afraid that he ridiculed and mocked me, although he wouldn't have. But there is always that little bit of fear at God's threshold. Just a little bit. Sometimes larger, sometimes less. I don't know how far it felt when you ended up going to Thailand. You were there how long? You were there
3 weeks.
Okay, but you were, you were in England for a long time, right? Yes, but going to Thailand, don't drink the water. Don't eat any of the bugs. Whether they're chocolate covered or not. So anyway, I need to move along. There's never enough time once you get talking about these remarkable people, because these are just people like us. Nehemiah he has some special gifts. But he's pretty much like us, thrust in a position of responsibility. Anyway, a leader must first overcome fear and demonstrate a trust in prayer. And then he has to share the plan with the people. That's coming. But he's going to trust in the prayers that he's laid out in front of God, that petition. What do we do? What am I to do? What doors do I go through? What are the thresholds of fear I must cross? Give me the faith to pass through it. You see how easy it would be for Nehemiah to quit in chapter 2, verse 1, and say, uh-oh, I can't go any farther. I'm paralyzed by fear. He could back up, and there would never be a book of Nehemiah. Maybe the wall wouldn't get rebuilt. Or maybe it would be rebuilt because God raised someone else up. But God raised up Nehemiah. Who in this congregation is God raising up? All of us, if I might be so bold to suggest. All of us. So we won't get to all the passages that I handed out, but who has Proverbs 3:5 on that little card? Yes, thank you. Could you just read that for me, with us?
Trust in the Lord with all my heart, and lean not unto thy own understanding.
Isn't that great? Such a beautiful verse. It's so hard to be captured by. But I think I know God. I think I know, and I'm scared. And that's a big deal. Someone has 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 8. So whoever has that, does they read that for us, please? Anybody have that one? Maybe I gave that to you. Okay, let's try another one. Psalm 20, verse 7.
I got it.
Thank you.
Psalm 20, verse 7. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God.
Remember and trust. Sometimes the challenges of trusting God in adverse or difficult times is a bit of a challenge. We can be honest about that because we're people. We're flesh and blood. So he's done this big prayer. Let's read the rest of the way from verse 3 on. I have to turn my big book page here. And I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth in waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? And the king said to me, For what dost thou make request? So here he is, in the moment. Have you ever done this? In the moment, you're in a conversation, and all of a sudden, pow, the door opens, and you're like, this is so cool, God. He's asking me what I want, the king. He's not saying, come in here and chop his head off. He's saying, ask me, what request are you making? And Nehemiah is knocked to prayer. And then he prayed. I don't think he falls on his knees in front of the king to pray, but I think he's making another prayer. Dear God, let this plan come together. You've opened this first door. I take that as affirmation. How? Can you feel it building now? You feel it all of a sudden? God's faithfulness, giving him the promise that, okay, I've done this one thing. Ask away, baby, because I've already made the way straight. All you got to do is go. So let's look at the things he asked for. This is so cool. I did this once when we were trying to get a youth center in Geneseo, 25, 30 years ago. And the corner bagel shop, the donut shop there on Bank Street and Main Street there, just by the fountain, was vacant. And I knew the man who owned it. And so we met with our team and met with this man. And we said, yeah, this will work just fine. And the guy said, well, when do you want it? And he said, well, as soon as you get it. And he said, well, the rent is. And I said, oh, no, sir. No. We'd like you to give it to us rent-free. over that one because he said, "What, are you serious?" And I said, "Absolutely." And he said, "I don't think I can do that." I said, "Okay, God, I guess I got to go find another tree to bark on." That wasn't going to be it. But sometimes you do this. That was a crazy bold thing to do. What did they do that for? I don't know. I wasn't putting God to the test. So anyway, let's look. I got to go quickly here. This is so exciting to me. Anyway, I said to the king, "If it please the king, and if thy servant found favor in thy sight," obviously that's the case, "that thou wouldst send me to Judah unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I might build it." And the king said to me, and the queen's right there too, "Well, for how long is this going to take? And when wilt thou return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Can you just imagine Nehemiah standing there saying, "My God is an awesome God. He reigns." Oh my. This is awesome. This is the way we should feel every day. To ask boldly, to take risks for God, and to see faith amplified. So he goes on. By the way, verse 7, I love this. I said to the king, "If it please the king, let letters be given me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over till I come into Judah." This was important for his protection and safety and travel, of course. Otherwise, he could have been ambushed, attacked, killed, robbed, you name it. So he had these letters. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace, which appertain to the house, and for the wall of the city. And for the house I shall enter into. And the king granted me, according to the good hand of my God upon me. This is no small permission slip. This is huge. Logs large enough to be made into timbers for the gates of the city wall is more valuable than gold. Thus, you've heard of the cedars of Lebanon? The cedars of Lebanon weren't an endless amount of cedars. This was an old growth forest, which is just phenomenal. You could get killed for going to cut down trees in Judah, unless you had official permission. So he gets, do you know how much lumber? This is a major logging operation. This is absolutely astonishing. And he said, "Okay, okay, what do you need? Okay, you need a letter of permission? Okay, you need trees? Okay." And then the floodgates now spill open. And he says, "Then I came to the governors beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had set captains of the army and horsemen with me." Not only did he had it all. Whatever you want, Nehemiah, just ask away. Just ask away. So in 3 in the outline, he has to overcome fear before the king. God gives him the faith to overcome that fear. He finds favor with the king. He says, "Send me to Judah and rebuild." He says, "Give me letters. Send me army officers. Send me cavalry." I mean, my goodness gracious. He gets everything and then some. You see what happens when you act in faith? God will bless that beyond your wildest imagination. Is trust Him. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and don't trust your own understanding. How hard it is for us to get past that. How hard it is for us to get past that. This to me is one of the most astonishing Old Testament feats, interaction between God and man, because there's no way in God's green earth that Nehemiah is actually going to get to go do this. I mean, he doesn't even know what kind of a job it's going to be, other than what his brothers and other men coming from Jerusalem described to him as being the place is a disaster. Well, what could that mean? I mean, today we have a pretty good idea of what disasters are. We look at Florida and Texas and Puerto Rico, and we think these are disasters. I saw the news yesterday that the governor hopes they can have all electricity restored everywhere in Puerto Rico by the end of December. End of December? Anybody live around here during the ice storm of what year was that there?
91.
91? You remember that ice storm? We were out of electricity for 7 days. 7 days? Let me tell you what. We had a wood stove so we could cook water and pancakes and eggs and stuff like that. But 7 days without electricity seemed like a long time. It was a bit of an adventure. But it seemed like, can you imagine going months and months and months without basic services? That's a catastrophe. Now Nehemiah's going to this thing, and he doesn't even know how big a catastrophe this is. How am I ever going to pull it? So he's in prayer as he goes. God, you're going to have to show me how to do this. I don't know, how am I going to marshal all the people? How am I going to get all the people together and go in one direction? There's not, we'll look at it next week, there's not one stone mason listed in chapter 3. There are no stone workers. There are no chiselers. There are perfume makers and goldsmiths and merchants and shepherds. How is he ever going to get all these amateur wall builders to build a wall of any substance? Nehemiah's task is far from done, and it's still not too late to turn back. What if he goes and he sees this and puts a plan together, but yet he can't get the people together? What if he fails at mobilizing the troops? That would be my biggest fear, I think. We could figure this out together, but if we don't do it together, we'll all fail. That's I think, the fear Nehemiah has. So anyway, to wrap up, on the reverse side, how did he begin to rebuild the people? You can read through the rest of Nehemiah chapter 2, but he challenges them, tells them what's going on. Verse 17, he says, let us rebuild. And he reinforces that by marshaling his troops, by giving a personal testimony of what God has already done. Let me tell you, like Job, we go back to the beginning of our lesson, Job, through his adversity, then in its conclusion, saw afresh, anew, for the first time, something about God he'd never seen before. Here's Nehemiah. I want to tell you what God has been doing for me. Listen to me. You know that God is in this. He has opened the doors with the king. As I prayed in faithfulness, he's got to marshal the troops. And one of the techniques he uses is to tell this personal testimony of how this happened. And then he affirms in verse 20 that the God of heaven will give him success, but all the people. Will God bring you so far to let you fail at his work? And anyway, who will determine what constitutes failure or success but God? We may think we succeed, but miss the mark. We may think we fail, and that's exactly where God wants us to be. It's a matter of being faithful. And lastly, I suggest to you that it has never been about a broken rock wall around the city of Jerusalem. It's always been about God's people and God's city and God's honor. That's a huge deal. Who cares about a bunch of broken rocks, for goodness sake, around an ancient city? Sure, it means something, or symbolic of something, but it has to do with God's people. This is us. This is us. And I want to encourage you to really meditate and think about that this week, about how many similarities are there between Nehemiah and us? Us personally and us as a church. Understand what I'm saying? I think there are lessons for us to learn from that. And we'll see where we get. Next week's exciting because they actually get started building tomorrow. That's scary. If anybody's ever smashed their fingers or hands trying to build a rock wall, you might have some appreciation for what they're about to teach you. Let's pray for them all. Okay. Father, we thank you so much. You are a dear and precious God to give us a record of the accomplishments of you through Nehemiah. We praise you that you have shown us in this passage once more that you lead, that you open doors, that this is not something Nehemiah got figured out on his own or manipulated or worked out. This was something he came to the threshold of fear and saw that you opened the door of your faithfulness to the accomplishment of a great work. What a lesson for us to be reminded of. We thank you. We praise you. Help us to be as worthy of the work as Nehemiah and the people who were living in Jerusalem at that time. Faithful people. You still want to do more with us, Father. I believe that. Lead on to the thresholds that we must go through in order to see your true and marvelous greatness in ways in which we've never seen it before. We pray in your name. Amen and amen. Thank you all.